So the question is, how do I know God's will for my life? Well, let's look at that from two angles. There's God's will that we do know, and there's God's will that we don't know. Oftentimes people will ask that question in terms of what we don't know. Where should I go to school? What is God's will for my career? Should I be a teacher or a doctor? Does God want me to work at this place or at that place? Where does God want me to live? In this city or that city? Should I be dating this person or not? What is God's will for my life in terms of those things? And those are things that we don't necessarily know. But sometimes we get so focused on those things that we don't know about God's will that we lose sight of the things that we do know about God's will. And the source of what we do know about God's will is the Scriptures. And what we do know about God's will has to do with our character and our conduct. For example, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning in verse 3, Paul says, "It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each one of you should learn to control his or her own bodies, not in passionate lust like the pagans." So right there in the Scriptures, we have God's will for our life with regard to character and conduct. In 1 Thessalonians 5, 16 and following, Paul says, "Be joyful always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." So there again we have it. We know God's will for us in terms of character and conduct. To name another, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. Peter says, "For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men." So we know God's will in terms of character and conduct, that which we do know about God's will. And that's where our focus should be. Our focus should be on pursuing and doing God's will in terms of biblical principles. Now, when it comes to what we don't know about God's will, when it comes to things like who we should date, where we should live, where we should work, well, we should certainly filter those decisions through biblical principles. For example, one young man, he had an opportunity to work in an amazing company, getting just great benefits, great pay, but his position would require that he would be monitoring several screens, one of which would be adult content. Well, that can be filtered through biblical principles. That can be filtered through that which we do know about God's will, namely what we looked at in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 and following. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality. And something like that would certainly be a stumbling block in that case. So a job opportunity in that arena could easily be rooted out. Well, sometimes we have equal opportunities. There's this job, job A, and then there's job B, and neither of them violate biblical principles. Both of them seem to be equally conducive to character and conduct development toward the character of Christ. And so when it comes to decisions like that, we just need to implement practical wisdom and weigh our options in terms of everyday practical things like commute. How far is the commute? What is the pay? What are my benefits and things like that? But ultimately when it comes to elements of God's will that we don't know, I believe we should relax and just trust God to take care of those things, because I don't believe that we can thwart God's will. Ephesians 1:11 says that He works everything out. He works everything according to His own will and purpose. He works out everything in conformity with the purpose of His will. When it comes to wanting to know if something is God's will or not, I believe that the easiest way to know is if it happens. For example, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 17, Peter says, "It is better to suffer for doing good, if it is God's will, than for doing evil." Well, how do you know if it's God's will for you to suffer? Well, if you suffer, then you know it was God's will for you to suffer. So, in the end, I believe that when it comes to trying to discern God's will for our lives, when we ask that question, what is God's will for my life? I believe we should do so in terms of what we do know, what we can know, and our source for that is the Scriptures. And we should focus in on those things, character and conduct in conformity to the image of Christ. That's where our focus should be. My name is David Boone. I'm the pastor of New Covenant Fellowship in Georgetown, Texas. We meet at the Page House on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m., 1903 J.M. Page Lane.